You're a royal physician in the Palace of Madrid, and the year is 1834. The king is dead, but your work is far from over. You've been summoned to a private chamber, not just any room, but the one that held the most disturbing, most perverse legacy in Spain's royal history. It reeks of incense and power. As you enter, Queen Regent Maria Cristina stands with silent tears streaking her powdered cheeks. Her lips quiver. Then the request leaves her mouth, a sentence so absurd, so unnatural, that it paralyzes you mid-breath. You're to preserve the body of the late King Ferdinand VII, all of it, even the part that history dared not speak of, the monstrous, deformed organ that had ruled Spain in more ways than one. As you step closer to the bed, you pull back the silk sheets, and there it is, the infamous royal endowment, an anatomical grotesquerie, not a symbol of virility, but a twisted monument to centuries of incest, cruelty, and obsession. It's longer than your forearm, knotted and bent in ways that seem medically impossible. Rumor had it even the Vatican banned all official illustrations of it. And now, you're face to face with it. Even in death, the man mocked Spain from the grave. A man whose rule was as deformed and painful as the thing that lay beneath the sheets. Before we explore how this horrific physical curse shaped a tyrant, and how it destroyed 3 queens, fractured an empire, and nearly drove an entire court to madness, consider liking and subscribing if you crave history's darkest untold truths. Comment below where you're watching from. It blows my mind we can all explore these forbidden chapters of the past together, across centuries, across continents, united by pure curiosity. Because to understand Ferdinand VII, you must understand the curse that made him, not a curse of witches or devils, but a curse born in blood, twisted royal blood. Ferdinand was the inbred product of centuries of genetic roulette. The Spanish Habsburgs and Bourbons had spent generations marrying cousins, uncles, even nieces. Why? To keep power in the family. But that very strategy turned the bloodline toxic. Ferdinand, born October 14th, 1784 at El Escorial Palace, came into this world already marked for tragedy. His parents, Charles IV and Maria Luisa Parma, were themselves first cousins. Their union was arranged not for love, not for compatibility, but for legacy. And that legacy, it exploded into Ferdinand. Even as a child, Ferdinand was different, not just in temperament, but physically. His condition began to appear early. Servants whispered. Tutors looked away. Physicians scribbled notes they dared not read aloud. By adolescence, the truth became undeniable. The young prince possessed a genital organ so massive, so malformed, it defied medical logic. It was not just long, it twisted, bulged, swelled, narrowed in horrifying patterns. One terrified physician wrote that it resembled a billiard cue but reversed. Thin at the root, thick as a man's fist at the tip. Nearly 10 inches in its natural state, worse when aroused. Another physician, more poetic but no less appalled, called it a weapon of destruction, not reproduction. This was not a gift. It was a curse. A shameful, humiliating, alienating curse. In an era where classical ideals praised modesty, where refined masculinity was equated with proportion and discipline, Ferdinand's condition was seen as freakish. And Ferdinand knew it. He felt it, and it changed him forever. He grew up mocked by silence, the kind of silence that says too much. Courtiers avoided eye contact. Servants smirked behind closed doors. Foreign ambassadors gossiped in coded language, sending word back to Vienna and Paris of the Spanish embarrassment. And Ferdinand? He retreated inward, but not in sorrow. In rage. He became suspicious, bitter, twisted. He began to see ridicule in every bow, every smile, every polite gesture. What began as a physical abnormality soon metastasized into a personality defect, one that would, in time, rot a kingdom from within. Because for Ferdinand, power became the only way to silence the laughter. And what followed would become one of the most disturbing sagas in all of royal history. By the time Ferdinand reached adulthood, his condition had grown not only more grotesque, but more dangerous. Court physicians now spoke of it with hushed dread. Some suspected a rare hormonal disorder. Others, a cursed mutation from generations of royal inbreeding. But none dared say it publicly. Not in a palace ruled by secrets, shadows, and a prince who punished curiosity with exile or worse. Yet there was one duty no deformity could excuse: producing an heir. And so, at age 18, Ferdinand was married off to his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. She was beautiful, cultured, naive. She had heard tales of Ferdinand the Desired, a nickname cooked up by sycophants and political strategists. A fairy tale prince, they said. She expected romance. What she got was something else entirely. The wedding was grand. Stained glass cathedrals, orchestras, parades through the streets of Madrid. The public saw a charming royal couple beaming with hope. But the palace staff noticed something strange. Just before the wedding night, the king's personal valet arrived at the queen's chambers with a cart. Not flowers, not perfumes, but devices, custom cushions, leather straps, bottles of opium-laced oil, and a terrifying array of padded wooden supports. The queen's ladies-in-waiting were stunned. They were told it was royal custom. They weren't told the truth. Maria Antonia, a virgin raised under strict Catholic tutelage, had no idea what awaited her. No one had prepared her for the reality of Ferdinand's anatomy, because no one could have. That night, when Ferdinand unveiled himself, the screams echoed to the marble halls. One chambermaid, writing decades later in a hidden memoir, recalled it like a scene from a nightmare. Her Majesty shrieked and clutched the crucifix about her neck. She sobbed uncontrollably, crying, "Monster! Monster!" and would not stop shaking for hours. The royal guards were called off. Physicians rushed in, not to help, but to explain. The wedding night turned into a medical procedure. They used the cushions, the oils, the equipment. They sedated Maria Antonia with laudanum, an opium derivative, just to keep her still. And even then, the act left her bleeding and traumatized. That was how Spain's hope for an heir began, with sedation and sobs. After that, Ferdinand and Maria Antonia settled into a grim routine. Months passed, then years. Every attempt at intimacy became a ritual of horror. Ferdinand would summon his physicians. The chamber would be prepared. The queen would be dosed, propped, positioned. And the act, if it could be called that, would proceed like a clinical experiment. Despite their efforts, Maria Antonia did not conceive, at least not at first. But that didn't stop Ferdinand from blaming her. He accused her of sabotaging their efforts, of moving at the wrong moment, of secretly taking herbs to prevent pregnancy. But the truth was obvious to everyone, and no one could say it. The king was simply not capable of normal reproduction. His organ, too long, too wide, twisted and knotted in all the wrong places, made natural conception nearly impossible. Even with aid, every encounter caused damage, not union. Yet Ferdinand's obsession with producing an heir only intensified. He became obsessed with fertility potions, ancient alchemical remedies, exotic mystics who promised divine realignment. He drank powdered rhino horn, wore enchanted amulets, consulted charts of the moon. He forced Maria Antonia to participate in midnight rituals, lying under astrological diagrams painted on the ceiling, as robed astrologers chanted prayers for royal seed to take root. Once, he even consulted a traveling mystic who claimed Ferdinand was not deformed, but blessed, that his twisted form was a dragon's rod, and he need only perform the proper rites. For 3 months, Maria Antonia was subjected to bizarre sexual ceremonies involving incense, chanting, and acrobatic positions copied from texts that claimed Eastern origin. Twice, miraculously, she became pregnant. Both times ended in devastation. The first, a miscarriage at 4 months. The second, nearly full term, nearly killed her. Maria Antonia never recovered. She became addicted to laudanum. Her voice faded. Her eyes went dull. She was often seen praying endlessly in the chapel, clutching a virgin statue and begging forgiveness for sins no one ever named. In May of 1807, she died. Official cause, fever. But the court knew better. Maria Antonia had died of despair. Maria Antonia's death might have freed her from the horrors of her royal marriage, but for Ferdinand, It was only the beginning of a pattern that would define his reign. Use, discard, repeat. Publicly, he wept, a grief-stricken widower, draped in black, attending Mass, declaring days of mourning across Spain. Privately, he was already planning his next marriage. Ferdinand needed an heir, Spain needed stability, and the court needed a new woman to endure the king's cursed touch. Enter Maria Isabel of Portugal, another cousin, another political pawn. Barely 19 when she arrived in Madrid in 1816, radiant, hopeful, and utterly unaware of what had happened to Queen before her. Despite whispered warnings, the new princess believed her fate would be different. It wasn't. The preparations began again, but this time more elaborate. New cushions, revised harnesses, imported oils from Constantinople. Even a mysterious Ottoman specialist was smuggled into the palace, rumored to be an expert in royal intimacy disorders. The wedding was a show of imperial grandeur, designed to distract from the panic beneath the gold embroidery and velvet drapery. As guests toasted and fireworks lit the sky, physicians in white coats paced nervously behind chamber walls. Because everyone knew the real event wasn't a ceremony. It was a wedding night. What followed would haunt the court for decades. The screams returned, but this time they came with blood. So much blood that servants thought an attack had occurred. Furniture was broken, curtains ripped, the royal bed destroyed. Maria Isabel was found trembling in a corner, unable to speak, flinching at every shadow. For days afterward, she would not eat. Her stutter, previously non-existent, emerged overnight. The royal physicians called it nervous exhaustion. Historians today would call it what was psychological trauma. Ferdinand, frustrated by his failure, didn't see a broken girl. He saw defiance. He accused her of faking it, of secretly hating him, of conspiring with foreign powers to humiliate the Spanish crown. He had her letters intercepted, her chambers searched, her ladies-in-waiting interrogated. Even her books were confiscated, in case they contained coded messages. And yet, the attempts at intimacy continued, week after week, month after month. Each session carefully arranged, a grotesque parody of love, with straps, with aides, with physicians just outside the door, waiting in case something went wrong. Each time, Maria Isabel returned more hollow than before. One courtier described her as a living ghost, pale, silent, terrified of her own shadow. And the worst part? Ferdinand didn't stop. He couldn't, because failure to conceive wasn't just a personal embarrassment. It was a dynastic crisis. Spain's colonies in the Americas were rising up. The empire was breaking apart. And back home, whispers grew louder. If the king cannot produce an heir, maybe God has cursed him and the crown itself. That fear infected Ferdinand like a virus. He doubled down on mystics, tripled his intake of herbal aphrodisiacs, even commissioned a new team of palace artisans to develop marital aids never before seen in Christendom. Their secret workshop, buried deep beneath the palace, resembled a hybrid of a blacksmith's forge and a torture chamber. Leather, iron, intricate pulleys, all designed to make the impossible marginally less impossible. But it wasn't enough. In 1818, just 2 years into their marriage, Maria Isabel collapsed. Diagnosis, nervous exhaustion. But in reality, her body had given up. She died not in childbirth, but in self-preservation. Some whispered, suicide. Others said her soul simply surrendered. Ferdinand reacted the only way he knew how, with paranoia. He ordered autopsies, had her handmaidens arrested, accused her of treason, of poisoning herself to avoid her duties. But no poison was found, just a woman broken by a monster wearing a crown. And still, Ferdinand wasn't finished. Because now, after 2 dead wives, after endless humiliation, he was determined more than ever to succeed. A 3rd wife would be found, and this time she would be ready. In 1819, Ferdinand married for the 3rd time. Her name was Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a German princess, 24 years old, with noble blood, a modest dowry, and most importantly, no political leverage. Her family was broke, and they were desperate, which made her perfect. But Maria Josepha was not naive like the others. Her Saxon physicians had warned her, discreetly but firmly, she would be marrying a man whose private conditions were unlike anything documented in modern European medicine. She was told of cushions, straps, oils. She was told of pain, of trauma, of 2 dead queens. And so, unlike her predecessors, Maria Josepha came prepared. She brought her own physicians, her own apothecaries, even her own collection of surgical tools and marital devices, some crafted by artisans in Vienna, others smuggled out of Prague's underground anatomical circles. To her, the marriage was not romantic. It was a clinical trial. The wedding was subdued, more function than fantasy. No grand parades, no endless masses, just a quiet ceremony followed by a carriage ride to the palace, where a new chapter of horror would begin. From a very first night, Maria Josepha documented everything. She kept a ledger of every sexual attempt, recording dates, positions, medical support used, Ferdinand's level of arousal, and her own psychological state. She called it Experimental Journal, Royal Conjugation Attempts. The entries were cold, scientific, emotionless. Night of January 12th. Attempted alignment with modified cushion German model. Pain threshold exceeded midway. Application of lavender oil ineffective. Result, unsuccessful. Emotional state, numb. This detachment enraged Ferdinand. He didn't want to be studied. He wanted to be desired. The Queen's methodical approach made him feel mocked, reduced to a subject of medical curiosity. His insecurities exploded into paranoia. He accused her of documenting his condition for foreign spies. He ordered her quarters searched. He had her letters to Saxony intercepted, and even considered executing her physician for treason. Meanwhile, Maria Josepha carried on with robotic calm. She scheduled sessions twice a week. She met with her own medical team to discuss adjustments. She submitted herself to invasive procedures as casually as one might go to confession. And somehow, despite the chaos, she conceived. In 1829, the court was stunned to learn that Maria Josepha was pregnant. Europe buzzed. Was it divine intervention? A medical breakthrough? A miracle? A hoax? Ferdinand, now 45 and graying at the temples, was ecstatic. He believed at last he had conquered the curse. He quadrupled the palace guard, hired priests to bless the child's nursery daily, imported silk-lined bassinets from Florence, ordered astrologers to track the stars every night. This child would be his legacy. But destiny had other plans. In the 7th month, Maria Josepha began bleeding. Her physicians panicked. Ferdinand, refusing to let them act without his consent, delayed the emergency procedures while he demanded a second, third, fourth opinion. He even summoned a mystic midwife from Toledo who promised to realign the womb using sacred chant and crushed emerald powder. It failed. Maria Josepha went into premature labor. The baby, a girl, survived only a few hours. Maria Josepha, weakened by blood loss and infection, died 3 weeks later. And this time, Ferdinand broke. He refused to let their bodies be buried. He ordered resuscitation attempts on a corpse. For days, the palace stank of decay as royal physicians, under threat of death, tried to revive what was beyond saving. When at last he allowed burial, he kept death masks of both mother and child, and placed them in a private chamber, where he often sat in silence, speaking to them as if they still lived. The court was horrified, and still, somehow this was not the end. Because as Spain crumbled, as revolution stirred in the colonies, as famine spread and royal coffers emptied, Ferdinand made a final decision. He would marry again. But this time, he wouldn't even pretend. It was 1829. Ferdinand VII was 45 years old, physically exhausted, mentally deteriorating, and politically isolated. His body bore the scars of years spent battling a deformed anatomy, and his kingdom groaned under the weight of his paranoia. And yet, he would marry again, not for love, not even for lust, but for legacy. The bride? Maria Cristina of Naples, another young cousin in the ever-twisting family tree of royal inbreeding. She was elegant, polite, obedient, and more importantly, already pregnant. Yes, pregnant before the wedding. And Ferdinand knew. He knew the child wasn't his. But he didn't care, because Maria Cristina offered him something far more precious than fidelity, the illusion of a legitimate heir. So, the wedding proceeded. The bride walked the aisle, glowing with life. The groom limped behind her, broken in body and spirit, clinging to a lie as if it were salvation. And then, in 1830, the miracle arrived. Isabella II was born. The people rejoiced. The courtiers cheered. But behind palace walls, Ferdinand stared at the infant with haunted eyes. Was she his? No. Did it matter? Also no, because the throne now had a future, even if it was built on fraud. But that fragile lie required maintenance. Constant, obsessive, suffocating maintenance. Ferdinand's paranoia, already legendary, exploded. He had mirrors installed in Maria Cristina's chambers to spy from secret passageways. Servants were hired not to serve, but to watch. Every letter the Queen wrote was intercepted. Every dish was tasted. Every glance between her and male courtiers was dissected for hidden meaning. He even commissioned portraits of baby Isabella, demanding that artists make the child resemble him. When they failed, he had them redrawn, over and over again. One poor painter was exiled for painting the baby with eyes too foreign. The palace transformed into a fortress of surveillance. Guards rotated daily. Food was locked until tested. And the Queen? She began to unravel. Her diary, discovered a century later, reveals the horror. I feel like an animal under glass. Watched, measured, judged. Even in my dreams, I see his eyes through the walls. Maria Cristina began flinching at shadows. Her health declined. She grew pale, anxious, withdrawn. Yet she had no choice but to play the role of loyal wife to a man who had made watching her suffer his full-time obsession. And still, Ferdinand tried to touch her, tried to make another child, this time truly his. But time had robbed him of even the faint illusion of virility. His body no longer responded. His mind no longer trusted itself. He called physicians daily, demanding new elixirs, new salves, new prayers. He even returned to his old surgeons, begging them to reshape what nature had given him. They refused, so he tried himself. Late one night, palace servants found the king bleeding in his chambers, a blade in one hand, a mirror in the other. He had attempted to cut away the very thing that had haunted him his entire life. He survived, but his sanity? Gone. He began hallucinating, speaking to his dead wives, ordering assassinations of imaginary conspirators, shouting at portraits, staring for hours at Isabella's crib, whispering prayers, curses, and fragments of old medical notes. The government, paralyzed by fear, let him rule in name only. Spain was crumbling. Its king was a ghost, a shell wrapped in velvet robes, clutching a child that wasn't his, and a crown that no longer meant anything. And yet, somehow, the worst was still to come. By 1833, the man once called Ferdinand a desire to become a trembling husk of his former self, his face sunken, his hands shaking, his eyes, bloodshot from nights without sleep, darted constantly to the shadows, convinced assassins were hiding behind every curtain, every candle. His body had rotted under the pressure of a lifetime of dysfunction. Spain was in free fall. The empire Ferdinand had inherited now resembled a corpse, much like himself, bloated, disfigured, and rotting from the inside out. And in the heart of it all lay his secret, that monstrous, grotesque organ, the one that caused so much shame, so much pain, so much death. 3 queens had been broken. 1 daughter, possibly illegitimate, sat in a golden crib built on lies. And now, the king's final hours had arrived. Bedridden, raving, and barely lucid, Ferdinand refused food. He would bark orders to ghosts, accuse walls of betrayal, and whisper the names of potions long banned by the church. He still demanded inspections of Maria Cristina's chambers, even as his pulse weakened and his skin turned waxen. He still clung to the hope that, somehow, God would give him a son, despite knowing full well he had never fathered a child. The palace physicians gathered, helpless. not because they couldn't treat him, but because they had spent years treating the wrong disease. Ferdinand had never needed potions. He had needed peace. And it was the one thing no throne, no prayer, and no bride could give him. On September 29th, 1833, Ferdinand VII of Spain finally died. The official cause was gout, but those who saw his final moments knew better. He died of exhaustion, not just of body, but of shame, rage, paranoia, and the crushing weight of a secret he could never silence. But even in death, he would not rest, because the royal physicians, those same men who had spent decades trying to fix him, were given one final task: to preserve the king's organ. Yes, that deformed, unholy relic, that thing whispered about in corridors and joked about in foreign courts, was embalmed, measured, drawn, and sealed away. The notes were explicit. Length, 14 inches. Variable girth. Curvature abnormal. Tissue nodes present. Evidence of internal scarring. Possible signs of self-inflicted modification. It was stored not in a royal museum, not in a medical university, but in a sealed vault in the Vatican, deemed too blasphemous, too politically explosive for public knowledge. And there it remains, a piece of flesh, a symbol of shame, a relic not of power. But what happens when absolute authority meets absolute dysfunction? Because Ferdinand VII did not rule Spain with sword or a crown or even a mind. He ruled it with a body he could not control. And that body destroyed everything. His wives, his heirs, his subjects, and ultimately his legacy. Spain would limp on into revolution, civil war, and collapse. His daughter Isabella would take the throne, a child queen born from a lie, destined to fight for a kingdom her father had already ruined. But Ferdinand, he had achieved a form of immortality, not in glory, not in triumph, but in horror, because history will remember him not as the desired, but as something else. The king whose most intimate curse shaped an entire nation's downfall, the most perverted monarch to ever wear a crown, and the only one whose greatest monument was hidden beneath a sheet,